17 years back, I read this book called The Tipping Point, and I fell in love with the author Malcolm Gladwell. Since then, I've read all of his creation, and I also had the good fortune of meeting him in person back in 2009. Recently, he wrote this book called The Revenge of the Tipping Point, which is more like a ode to his earlier creation, The Tipping Point. I have read the book. I was very intrigued by what he has shared in the book, so I thought of creating a video to share with you all. Like I always say, my videos are not a replacement of the book. So please go ahead, pick up the book, read it. I guarantee you won't regret. I can decipher the entire book in two different segments. Segment one, as the author calls it, over stories. Over stories you can compare to foliage on ground. When you have leaves on the ground, it covers the ground surface. There's a whole different world underneath those leaves, which you are not privy to. Second concept, magic third. Magic third predominantly means that in a group setting, when the third of the group has the majority, then the third of the group can drive the behavior of the entire group. The author has taken many examples to prove that point, and there's a very important concept which is a core theme of the book. So let's begin. I'm going to talk about both of these concepts through different examples, divided by different lessons that I have learned. I hope you'll like what you'll hear. The first concept I want to introduce you to is social epidemic. When you think about social epidemic, words such as chaos, unruly, beyond control, haphazardly comes to your mind, which is not always true. Social epidemic actually happens with a control audience. Understanding this audience is critical because understanding them, you can control them and you can change the outcome of the social epidemic. Let me take a few examples to explain it. My first example is the measles crisis that happened in 2010 in California. During that particular period of time, all of the major media outlets said, this is beyond control, unruly, please don't send your children to school, so on and so forth. But like over stories, if you look beyond the leaves, you'll see a trend. If you actually see, the measles crisis happened to all those kids who were not vaccinated. Public schools, 100% of the kids were vaccinated. They were not infected. Private school, 90% almost thereabout were vaccinated. They were also not impacted. So who were impacted then? There's a chain of school known as Waldorf, a private school with schools all over California, and it's very costly to send your kids to those schools. Those are the schools where vaccination rate were really low. Some of the schools had rate of vaccination about 40%, somewhere in 30, somewhere in 20. Those were the kids who were actually getting impacted by measles. Very interesting indeed, right? So now that you know that, you can have a very different outcome in terms of how you want to attack it, what you don't want to do about it. Now it's a different story altogether, why the Waldorf kids were not getting vaccinated. That part is kind of related to magic third. There was a third of the population within Waldorf, they believe that vaccination is not important. So even if you're a parent who strongly believes in vaccination, but you start sending your kid to the schools, more often than you think, you will not vaccinate your kids. That's my first example. That brings me to the second example, the opioid crisis that happened in the US in the early 90s. During that point in time, it was a national news. Everyone thought it is unruly. It was happening all across the US beyond control. In fact, so much so that there were class action lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. Now, if you truly see, and if you again, like the over stories, look beyond the leaves, you will see that it was happening to only few states, not the entire US, where it was wildly spreading and wildly happening to people. States such as Oklahoma, states such as Nevada, states such as Delaware, those were the states where this was really, really unruly. Now, to understand why it was happening, I have to take you back to 1939. During that point in time, there was a gentleman with the name Paul E. Madden. Paul E. Madden was the director of the California Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement, and he was tired of all of those drug abuse that was happening in the market. And he felt that most of those drugs were coming from the pharmaceutical company, prescribed by the doctors. So he thought he will introduce a concept by which he can control it. And his law or his rule was triplicate, which predominantly means that every time a doctor is prescribing a drug which has an opioid kind of drug to the patient, they have to make 3 copies. 1 copy, they have to keep it with themselves for a period of 2 years. 1 copy will go to pharmacies. the pharmacist so that they can issue the drug to the patient, and the third copy, interestingly, has to be mailed to the bureau so that they can keep a copy of it and they can see where the abusement was happening. And then what happened? This was done first in California, and then there were great results because of that. Now the doctors were thinking twice before issuing any drug, which we are going to have some kind of an addictment kind of a philosophy. And seeing that, it was a national phenomenon. A lot of other states started following that, and they thought of following the same triplicate rule. Now, coming back to the opioid crisis, the states where the issues were the largest, where it was spreading like wildfire, those were the states which did not follow the triplicate rule. And hence you can see that there were no threat whatsoever, and the doctors were issuing what they want to. There was no obligation, no one was controlling them, no one was questioning them. They don't have to send a receipt back to the narcotics department or to the federal government, and they were free to what they believe, and they were prescribing the medication as they felt like. That brings me to the second concept, law of few. I want to first take an example, explain the example to you, and then explain to you that what does law of few mean. There is a very famous chemistry professor with the name Donald Stedman, who used to teach in University of Denver. In his lab, he created this contraption device using which in real time he can find out whether a vehicle is polluting the environment or not. For experimentation purpose, he put it on one of the Denver highway and found that there were only 5% of the car which were polluting the environment. Yet, they were the reason for the 55% of the pollution happening in Denver. He also believed that the traditional way of taking your cars to do your pollution control check is the old way of doing things. Why? Because the moment you know that you are up for the pollution check, you will make sure you tune the car, put the right engine oil. Think about the car sports enthusiast. They will put the right engine oil before they take there, and once the check is done, they are back on the road polluting the environment. His concept was do it real time. Find out those 5% of the cars so that you can reduce the pollution by 55%. Great concept indeed. Unfortunately, his concept was a lab concept, never got implemented, but highly recommend for some government to think about it and bring it to play accordingly. So what does law of few means? Law of few means that there are few people or few control factors who can actually decide the fate of a larger audience. Again, coming back to the concept of magic third. In magic third of your population, if they're having the majority, can define the fate of the entire group. So that's a concept very intriguing that I learned from this book, which I thought I'll introduce to you. That brings me to the third concept. The third concept known as iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis is actually a word which basically means that when you are treating a patient, and if you are providing whatever medication you are trying to provide, if that medication is doing more harm than good, then actually not treating the medication, treating a disease, but you are having a medication which is causing more issues to you. We see it often in our society. An example in the book taken is a hypothetical school known as popular school, and you may see it in your social milieu as well. There's those schools where they thrive the kids to do their best. They are extending them. They are best in sports, best in education, taking part in all competition. But what happens when you stretch the kids to do so many things, they are not living a life and they become robots. And at times when you stretch them so far, they have mental imbalance. And when the mental imbalance happens, they take things in their hands, sometimes suicide, sometimes going into drugs, and so on and so forth. So that's a third concept, iatrogenesis, a word which is a very interesting word and having a very interesting meaning as well. That brings me to the fourth concept, group proportion. In group proportion, small members of the group can change the behavior of the entire group, something like a magic third. Let's try to understand this through an example. In the US, there is a procedure known as heart cath, where a probe is sent through an artery or a vein in the thigh all the way to the heart to monitor its performance and see what is going wrong with the heart so that you can use that to treat a patient. There's a second procedure also available known as radial insertion, where you send the same probe through an artery on your wrist rather than in your thigh. The procedure, radial insertion, is much more cheaper. It is also easier on the patient, and it is much more successful, yet it is not popular in the US. However, this is much more popular in Canada. And if I have to take an example, Buffalo, which is a town in upstate New York, which is very close to Canada, actually uses radial insertion. Why? Because if you cross the Niagara Falls, there's Canada. The people all the time comes from Canada to the US. Because of the close proximity, presumably radial insertion is more popular there. But here is the interesting point. There was a doctor who got transferred from Denver who has done for all his life this entire probing exercise using the hard cath procedure. He reached the lab the hospital in Buffalo, and he changes himself to the radial insertion. Very interesting indeed, right? And by the way, Buffalo Hospital did not hire him to do the procedure using radial insertion. Neither they have instructed him. They hired him because of his ethos, because of his values, because what he can bring to the table. And when he came there, he saw radial insertion. He converted himself to radial insertion. And this is the magic of what we call it as the group proportion, where when you have certain members in the group who are aligned to do certain things in a particular way, they kind of influence the other members to do things in their own manner. And which brings me to the final concept of the book, known as magic third. So that magic third is very important, which is the third of the population should have the majority to flip the group to behave or act like them. Sometimes it is used for a wise reason. Sometimes it is also used to game a system. A lot of the universities in the US use it to make sure that they can have the right population mix in the third, the way they want the university to behave, because they know that moment they flip that balance, the entire behavior of the university, the college will change accordingly. Those are the concepts I've learned in this book. Just to see, if you see all of those themes, there were two themes, right? One, looking beyond the leaves, like the foliage, to see what was going underneath the ground. All the examples I took about social epidemic, law of few was all related to that. Second example is all about there is small portion, a small capacity can have a larger impact. And again, if you want that impact to happen, sometimes you have to bring it to the magic third proportion. Those are the broadly two lessons learned through the different examples I've taken. Hopefully you liked what you have heard here. I look forward to your feedback, comments, and please do let me know if you've read the book, what you think about it. Thank you once again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time around. Bye.